All right, as people in Hawaii heard on Saturday morning, this is not a false alarm. No, they heard the opposite, didn't they? I'm Jane Frances Kelly. I'm Director of the David Hume Institute. Welcome to the 2018 Politicians and Professionals series, now in its 5th year. Conceived by the last but one Director of the Institute, Jeremy Peat, the series was not initially designed to become an annual fixture. But to misquote a former UK Prime Minister, events, dear boy, keep happening. So this year we'll hear from the leaders of each of Scotland's main political parties on their view of Scotland after Brexit. I'd like to thank all of our sponsoring organisations in no particular order, and not, I think, in the order of the logos. The Faculty of Advocates, the Royal Society of Edinburgh, the Faculty of Actuaries, the Law Society, and the Young Academy of Scotland. I'd particularly like to thank Angela Graham, QC, for chairing the proceedings this evening, which will run broadly as follows. After I've asked you to turn off your mobile phones and thanked the First Minister for joining us this evening, she'll speak for something around 30 minutes. The Chair will then moderate an audience Q&A, which will start with a question from a Fellow of the Young Academy. Following the Q&A, Sir John Elvidge, our Chair of Trustees, will propose a brief vote of thanks. Then Professor Nasser Mir, another Fellow of the Young Academy, will take a couple of minutes to speak about their work. In return for listening, the Young Academy have generously sponsored the drinks reception that will follow, and we'll be looking to have you in the lobby with a glass of wine in your hands from 7:35 p.m. at the latest. In Scotland, it's been an even busier few days than usual with Brexit matters, so rather than taking up more time commenting on events, I'll straight away hand over to a woman who needs no introduction. So please turn off your mobile phones and join me in welcoming the First Minister of Scotland, Nicola Sturgeon.
Thank you very much indeed, Jane Frances, for that introduction. Thank you to all of you for coming along here in not the best weather we've ever had. I don't want to be the bearer of bad news, but it's going to get worse before it gets better. But it is a real pleasure for me to be here this evening. As Jane Frances has just indicated, this Meet the Leaders session has become something of a New Year tradition. It is almost becoming part of the Winter Festival programme. It will soon be as prominent and as globally well known as Edinburgh's Hogmanay celebrations. So I very much welcome it. Another tradition that has developed over the last couple of years is that I have tended to turn up late. So for that, my sincere apologies. Most of the times I have had what I consider to be good excuses, but I'm sorry for being a few minutes late again this evening. But to be serious, I think this series of events is a really good, a very powerful demonstration of the Institute's role in leading and informing public debate in Scotland. And I greatly value the opportunity. I'm sure all of the party leaders value this opportunity highly, because it is an opportunity for me to discuss directly with you some of the big issues facing Scotland now and in the future. All of the leaders this year, of course, have been asked to speak about Brexit specifically. And in doing that, in the second half of my remarks, I want to focus on an issue that I was talking about yesterday, and that is the issue of migration. It's an issue which is of considerable importance to Scotland, and one where Brexit presents us with very distinct challenges, which to my mind require some distinctive solutions as well. But before I turn to that, I thought it would be useful to give a brief overview of where I think the Brexit process is now. I actually kind of read that earlier on and thought, how is it possible to give a brief overview of where I think the Brexit process is now? And the answer to that question was in a mess, which is pretty brief, but that would be far too glib. But I want to give you that overview, but more importantly, give you my views and outline the Scottish Government's priorities for seeking to influence that process as best we can in the year that lies ahead. It's actually next week marks, and I know you all know this, and I'm not telling you anything you don't already know here, but next week marks exactly 5 years, it's quite hard to believe this, since David Cameron delivered the speech in which he committed to having a referendum on EU membership, perhaps one of the most significant and fateful political speeches in the UK's recent history. He made that speech at the Bloomberg offices in London and announced that if the Conservative Party won the 2015 general election, he intended to hold that in-out referendum on EU membership. And in that speech, he set out his belief that Britain's national interest is best served in a flexible, adaptable and open European Union, and that such a European Union is best with Britain in it. Of course, the eventual consequences of that speech, as we now know, turned out to be the exact opposite of what he intended when he made that commitment. Time, of course, has flown by since then, and today we stand just 14 months away from the date when the UK is set to leave the European Union. Now, let me be clear, and I don't think I'm telling you now anything that you don't already know. I still don't want Scotland or the UK to leave the EU. My preference is and will continue to be for Brexit not to happen. In fact, and I'm definitely not giving you any world exclusives now, my preference is for Scotland to be an independent member state of the European Union. I think that would serve our interests best, and I think it would be good for the European Union as well. However, as First Minister of Scotland, I have a duty to do all that I can to seek to protect Scotland's interests in all circumstances. And tonight I want to concentrate on how we are seeking to influence the situation now and how we will do that in the crucial weeks and months that lie ahead in order to help shape the best possible outcome for not just Scotland, but I hope for the UK as a whole. And in looking at that, I've got to be pretty frank with you in saying just how disturbing I think it is that just 14 months away from the planned exit from the European Union, the UK government's plans still do seem to be, and I'm putting this as mildly as I can, in a state of chaos. And that is partly, I think, because there still seems to be a denial, at times it appears to be a willful denial of the complexities that are associated with Brexit. I heard the leader of the House of Commons say this just last week. It will be easy for the UK and the EU to agree to continue to do things with zero non-tariff barriers. And to be quite blunt about it, that's not a statement that has any roots in reality whatsoever. Avoiding non-tariff barriers, which I'm sure everybody wants to do, requires to reach agreement on harmonised regulations and a whole range of other matters. It's not something which will be easy to agree. In fact, the trade deal between the EU and Canada took almost a decade to negotiate. The Prime Minister, meanwhile, continues to suggest that no deal is a viable option for the UK, without acknowledging that no deal is, almost by definition, a terrible deal for the UK. In my very simple view, no Brexit has to be preferable to no deal. And the UK government, perhaps most fundamentally of all, is still delaying setting out a clear proposition on the big issue that it faces, or what the end relationship is that it is seeking to negotiate. Everybody knows that, as in any negotiation, there will require to be trade-offs. Trade-offs, for example, between abiding by European regulations in order to gain access to the single market on the one hand, and on the other hand, having the freedom and flexibility to negotiate separate trade deals with countries outside of the EU. In fact, the UK Cabinet has scarcely even begun to discuss some of these issues, let alone agree or articulate a clear position on them. Instead, we are still told that it perhaps is possible for the UK to get absolutely everything it wants, to have its cake and eat it. So it can have regulatory flexibility, the freedom to do trade deals with other countries, and the full benefits of the single market, despite all of the evidence to the contrary. So I think 2018, a crucial year in so many different respects, is going to be inevitably the year that rhetoric finally meets reality. And when we look back over the last 6 months of last year, what we saw was that on every issue of substance where agreement in the first phase of negotiations had to be reached, for example, on the timetable of the talks, on much of the situation around EU citizens, or on settling the EU's budget obligations, the UK government started with a completely unrealistic position, and then on all of these issues was forced to capitulate and finally agree the position that had been the starting position of the EU all along. And that, I think, is almost certain to happen all over again if the plan is to stick to unrealistic positions. Far better, surely, to stop wasting time and to stop squandering goodwill and instead embark on this next phase of negotiations with a sensible and a credible position at the outset. Now, in my view, in the view of the Scottish Government, that's sensible. I think the only sensible post-Brexit position for the UK is continued membership of the single market and the customs union. Now, let me be clear, I don't think that is a perfect position. It's not as good as membership of the EU. The EU is not a perfect institution. It has many flaws and it frustrates me in many ways as it does others. But I think our interests are best served by being in rather than out. So being in something short of that is not the perfect position. But being in the single market is far preferable to any of the quite limited number of alternative future relationships. In my view, and I don't think you'll be surprised to hear me say this, every month that has passed since the referendum has borne out the logic of that position. If the UK is to leave the EU, the least damaging way of doing so is to retain single market and customs union membership. And the economic importance of that was highlighted and underlined in the paper that the Scottish Government published yesterday. Yesterday, we published the most extensive economic modelling of the potential future relationships that has been done by anybody so far, which perhaps speaks volumes in itself about the approach the UK Government has taken. They have yet to publish modelling and impact assessment of that nature of their own. But the modelling that we published yesterday shows very clearly that although all forms of Brexit are likely to harm our economy in some way, they will, for example, reduce our exports to the UK's largest market, but also by extension, reduce our productivity and over the longer term restrict our ability to attract talent to our country. So all of the future options will do some damage to our economy. But there is no doubt, and the modelling bears this out, that harder Brexit will cause significantly greater damaging. The modelling suggests that what the paper we published yesterday does, and it's available online if anybody wants to read it in more detail, it looks at what are probably the only three realistic options when the UK leaves the EU for the future relationship. They are the so-called no-deal option, where the UK reverts to World Trade Organization terms. Secondly, there's the option which the UK government says is its favoured option, the negotiation and conclusion of a free trade agreement, perhaps similar to the one with Canada, with bits added on to it. Or thirdly, single market and customs union membership. And what the evidence that we published yesterday shows, that the no-deal outcome will cost our economy by 2030 around £2,300 per head of population, compared to what our economy would do if we stayed in the EU. With a free trade agreement, the loss in GDP would be around £1,600 per head, and if we stay in the single market, that loss would be around £700 per head. So I'm summarising it here for brevity, but what that shows is there is no cost-free option to leaving the EU, but staying in the single market minimises the damage and that surely must be a priority for all of us. There's also, in addition to the economic argument, to my mind, a fundamental democratic point here. The EU referendum gave no clear mandate, I would argue no mandate at all, for leaving the single market. In fact, during the campaign, Leave campaigners were often very confused amongst themselves by lots of things, but in particular about this issue of the single market. We used to hear people, Boris Johnson included, saying things like it's not the what he described as the old common market that people object to, it's all the political regulation of the European Union. So often you would hear Leave campaigners saying it's not the single market we want to leave, it's everything else that goes with the EU. So the idea that leaving the EU requires us to leave the single market is simply an assertion. It is an interpretation of the referendum result. I don't think it is more than that. And actually, when you consider the closeness of the result across the UK, and indeed the fact that 2 of the 4 nations of the UK actually voted to stay in the EU, surely a soft Brexit rather than a hard Brexit should be the default position. So single market membership isn't just the best way of minimising the economic harm of Brexit, it is the obvious democratic compromise in a UK where opinion on this issue is deeply divided. So my priority, the priority of the Scottish Government for the year ahead in terms of trying to influence the UK's approach to this is to make that case for single market and customs union membership. And I believe that is a position that should and also can command majority support in the UK Parliament and also across the country. So as First Minister, as leader of my party, I will try to work with everyone and anyone across the political spectrum, across the UK generally, to contribute towards what I think is not the best option for the UK, but the least worst option if the UK is intent on leaving the EU. The duty to proceed in a way that respects the views of all parts of the UK is also relevant to the current debate right now over the EU withdrawal bill. That bill is back in the House of Commons this evening before it goes next to the House of Lords. Now that bill is important. It's a highly technical piece of legislation, but it is an important one. It's currently the subject of discussions between the devolved governments and the UK government. Both the Welsh and the Scottish governments have indicated that in its current form, we couldn't recommend to our respective parliaments that they approve that bill. It is subject to what is called the legislative consent process. Now, I should be clear that we in the Scottish Government, although we oppose Brexit, we accept the basic intention behind the bill. If the UK is to leave the EU, no matter how regrettable I think that is, there has to be a legal mechanism that allows EU law to be carried over into English and Scottish law at the point of Brexit. However, the way in which the UK government has chosen to enact the bill runs completely counter to the basic principles of devolution. It drives a coach and horse through the founding principles of the Scottish Parliament. In particular, Clause 11 of the bill, I'm not sure I would recommend you going to read the entire bill. It is extremely technical. But Clause 11, in summary, just to get the essence of what Clause 11 does, it prevents the Scottish Parliament, post-Brexit, from making any changes to devolved areas like justice or agriculture, if those changes wouldn't have previously been allowed under EU law. Now, you may say, well, that's fair enough, you weren't allowed to make those changes anyway. But the thing is, it allows the UK government to make changes in these areas. So effectively, the bill as it stands gives the UK government complete freedom to legislate in areas currently devolved to the Scottish Parliament without first getting the consent of the Scottish Parliament. Now, these provisions are hugely problematic. On a practical level, they massively increase the complexity of the devolution settlement. As the EU's own rules evolve and change, it will create an ongoing uncertainty about what the Scottish Parliament is and isn't allowed to do in devolved areas. But much more fundamentally than that, they undermine a basic principle of devolution. The whole principle underpinning the Scotland Act, that is the foundation legislation of the Scottish Parliament, is that all policy matters are devolved to Scotland unless they are specifically reserved under the Scotland Act. It is, it's the great genius that Donald Dewar brought to the drafting of the Scotland Act. And this withdrawal bill just turns that on its head. Effectively, it's saying that in these matters that are repatriated, everything is reserved unless the UK government in future decides to devolve them. And that's why Professor Nicola Sturgeon of the Centre on Constitutional Change said a few months ago, Clause 11 cuts across the existing devolution settlements. UK government ministers don't seem to get this. And more recently than that, just last week, the Scottish Parliament's Finance and Legislation Committee unanimously recommended that consent shouldn't be granted to the bill in its current form. And it's worth just repeating that point. All parties agreed that consent shouldn't be granted. Now, it's fair to say that Scottish political parties don't often come together and unite on constitutional questions. So the fact that the UK government has actually managed to deliver unanimity in the Scottish Parliament on a constitutional matter is a measure of their sheer achievement and probably deserves some kind of credit along the way. Interesting, I was reflecting ahead of tonight that it was actually in this speech that I gave to the David Hume Institute this time last year that I first raised this prospect, this concern that the Scottish Government had, that this process of Brexit was going to result in a power grab. And I remember making that speech here, and lots of the commentary from other political parties, from some of the media the next day, was that that was nonsense. I was scaremongering. I was, just trying to make up something that was never going to happen. And yet here we are a year on, and there is unanimous opinion in the Scottish Parliament that that is, in fact, what that bill represents. So we have work to do if we are to protect the principles of devolution to change that bill before it passes. There is actually an opposition amendment being debated tonight. We'll see whether that manages to be passed. I suspect it won't. But we were promised UK government amendments would have been lodged by this stage, and I think all parties are also unanimous in their disappointment that that has not happened. In fact, there now won't be amendments lodged before the House of Commons. The amendments will have to be lodged in the House of Lords, which actually raises its own democratic issues on a matter of such fundamental importance to devolution and the principles underpinning it. It will be the House of Lords that has to decide on these amendments. So there are a whole host of problematic issues in there. So I hope we can reach a settlement and an agreement on this, and we are still working hard to do that. But I think it's fair to say that while there is still the prospect of reaching agreement, and we will continue to do what we can to deliver that, the prospects are reducing rather than increasing. So as a result of that, the Scottish Government, with some regret, has been required to prepare our own EU continuity bill, which means that even if we cannot reach agreement on the UK's withdrawal bill, Scottish legislation will be able to protect our laws from disruption that would otherwise be caused by Brexit. That is not our preferred way forward. I think, and I say this as somebody who supports Scottish independence and is a passionate supporter of the Scottish Parliament, there is an argument that this legislation should be done UK-wide, but we cannot allow it to be done in such a way that it fundamentally and for the future undermines the very principles upon which our Parliament is built. So I hope that we will reach agreement, but we are prepared for the eventuality in which we don't. Moving on to the next topic I want to talk about, which I alluded to at the start, and the segue from where I've been into this is actually an important one, because in my view, the challenges that are posed by Brexit, and they are many and varied, are, at least in part, best met by a further devolution of powers throughout the UK, not a further centralisation of powers. The Scottish Parliament would benefit anyway, but perhaps particularly in light of Brexit, from having further powers over welfare, trade, employment, employability. But in particular, given some of the challenges we face, the Scottish Parliament would benefit hugely, and Scotland would benefit hugely with greater powers and greater flexibility over migration. And that's the issue I want to focus on next. And partly I want to focus on it because that issue was so central to the EU referendum debate. But more importantly, it's an area where Scotland's needs and requirements are actually very different from those in the rest of the UK. And the case for having a different approach here in future is, to my mind, overwhelming. Not uncontroversial, but overwhelming in face of the evidence. I say not uncontroversial because I am aware, and John Curtis produced some very interesting research on this just last week, that there isn't yet a clear public consensus behind having a distinct migration policy in Scotland. Add to that the fact that immigration is never an easy or a comfortable subject for politicians to be talking about. But given some of the very stark projections that I'm going to talk about in a moment, I believe really strongly that there is a duty on us, on politicians across the UK, but perhaps particularly in Scotland, to both spell out the importance of being able to attract skills and talent from other countries, and also to provide evidence and reassurance where it is needed about the benefits that migration brings to our economy and to our wider society. I think there is a pressing need, and what I'm about to set out here will evidence that need for all of us to try to change the narrative around immigration and free movement. When the impact of ending free movement within the EU is discussed right now, a lot of the focus tends to be on the immediate consequences for specific sectors of our economy. And that's very understandable because for many sectors of our economy, for many of our core public services, EU migration is crucial. You know, more than half of the people who work in the food processing industry right now are EU citizens. So are more than a quarter of our higher education researchers and almost a tenth of the workers in our tourism sector. The potential consequences, therefore, of reduced migration to those sectors are very important. And they are certainly one reason among many why I've been so determined ever since the referendum to ensure that the rights of EU citizens are given priority and protected, but also the EU citizens know that we welcome the contribution they make here and we want them to stay and to keep making that contribution. But I want to focus tonight on an issue really that transcends the immediate consequence of Brexit on specific sectors and talk instead about the consequences of any restriction in our ability to attract skills and talents here for our overall population level and for our economic prospects well into the future. And the figures here are stark, and they should make all of us sit up and take notice, and they should make every politician who cares about the future of this country recognise the responsibility we have, not to shy away from the debate on migration, but instead to take that on and, as I said, to seek to change the narrative. If you look at population projections for the UK as a whole over the next 25 years, 3/5 of the predicted population increase for the UK is projected to come from immigration, 2/5 is projected to come from natural change. Births will outnumber deaths. In Scotland, though, that's not the picture. In Scotland, the picture is very different. All of our projected population growth is estimated to come from inward migration. Births are not expected to outnumber deaths in any of the next 25 years. So without inward migration, our population will start to fall rather than rise. Now, when I was first a member of the Scottish Parliament, that was the situation we faced at the time. Our working age population was in decline, and we all talked about the imperative to turn that around. And over these last 15 years or so, it has turned around. And it has turned around entirely because of inward migration. So we need to think seriously about this in terms of our prospects for the future. If we see our population, particularly our working age population, decline at a time when we know, and this is a great thing, people are living longer, so our pensioner population is growing proportionately, then we will see that affect our overall economic growth. We will see it have an impact on our living standards. We will see the number of people in the workforce decline, which will make it more difficult to fund our public services. Actually, the Scottish Fiscal Commission, when they published their assessment of the Scottish Government's draft budget last month, pointed to this as a real concern. They've predicted that reduced income tax receipts as a direct consequence of less migration and a lower working age population is something that we need to think about. Now, I'm not standing here saying we should do nothing about trying to deal with the issue I've talked about around the natural growth in our population. There is evidence that support for parents can increase the birth rate. So the package of policies that we are adopting with the aim of making this the best country in the world to grow up in are important. All of that in time could lead to a higher birth rate than that is projected. But that's not certain. And of course, it will take around 2 decades before an increased rate of childbirth leads to an increased size of workforce. So in the short and medium term, and probably in the long term as well, we have a significantly greater need for migration in Scotland than the rest of the UK. Now, as I say, this isn't a new issue. This is an issue that was faced at the outset of the Scottish Parliament, and it was an issue that was recognised very expressly in those early days of our Parliament. That's why, for example, the previous Labour-Liberal administration, with cross-party support at the time, worked to introduce the Fresh Talent initiative in Scotland. That allowed people to stay and work in Scotland after they'd finished studying, even when they weren't allowed to do that in the rest of the UK. But the Fresh Talent initiative, perhaps because of its success, was then included within the wider UK immigration system. And then when the UK government decided to restrict immigration in 2012, they ended the post-study work visa because it was by then a UK policy, and that meant it ended in Scotland as well. And the reason I'm mentioning the Fresh Talent initiative is precisely because it is a good example, a real live example from our recent history of how sensible, practical, proportionate immigration policies have been enabled in order to allow us to address a particular problem. And you know, Fresh Talent is a good example for another reason, because it demonstrates that is possible. That a distinctive immigration policy, which is often thought to be something that is completely unworkable for Scotland, has actually, on a relatively small scale, been demonstrated to be possible and to work in the past. We also know that differentiated migration policies work in other countries. Australia, for example, different states have discretion to set different standards and requirements. South Australia has its own immigration office. The same is true in Canada, and in Switzerland, cantons have the autonomy to run their own immigration systems. So it's not surprising that 3 years ago, the Smith Commission, whose recommendations were signed off by all parties, recommended the reintroduction of the post-study work visa. That hasn't been implemented yet, and there are no plans on the part of the UK government at this stage to do it. But I think these things have to be looked at again if we are to address these real challenges that we face. So that's why we'll soon publish, as the Scottish Government, proposals for powers over immigration to be devolved. The reintroduction of the post-study work visa will be one of these proposals. We'll also argue that students should not count within the UK's targets, and will argue for a more distinctive approach to family migration. We think it's counterproductive to restrict the ability of British citizens, for example, to bring family members home. So these are concrete proposals we'll put forward in the near future, and I hope they meet with a constructive attitude. last point I want to make here is that this argument for a distinctive immigration policy, which, although it is meant to address a distinctive challenge we face, also, I suppose, is a recognition that the debate about our place in Europe isn't simply about trade rules and regulations, important though all of that is. This is also fundamentally a debate about who we are. It's a debate about what kind of country we are and what kind of country we aspire to be in the future. And I think it is so important for us in these crucial months that lie ahead to do everything we can to ensure that we remain an inclusive, welcoming, outward-looking country. A country that is determined to continue to contribute to the world in which we live, but one that is also open to new people and new ideas, that wants to attract to our shores the best talent from anywhere in the world. I began my remarks this evening by mentioning David Cameron's speech 5 years ago. 2018 also, of course, marks the 20th anniversary of the Scotland Act's passage through the UK Parliament. And so 20 years ago last week, that bill was being debated on the floor of the House of Commons. Donald Dewar introduced that debate. He made several remarks during it, which turned out to be very prescient. But this one in particular struck me. He described the Scottish Parliament as offering a new dimension to Scotland's representation in Europe. And I think we must be determined throughout this year, throughout all of the undoubted twists and turns that the year will take, we must be determined to do everything we can to maintain and strengthen that voice and that role in Europe and in the wider world. That's why arguing at least for us to remain within the single market and the customs union is important for economic and for wider reasons. But it's also why it is so important that we don't allow the devolution settlement, that hard-won devolution settlement, to be undermined. And it's why it is also important that we seek the new powers for immigration or in other areas that allow us in Scotland to retain and to build and to enhance that place in Europe and the world. So 2018 provides a lot of challenges, but it also provides an opportunity as the realities of Brexit finally have to be confronted to build support for these measures, not simply in Scotland but across the UK. Because if we do build that support and that consensus, we'll minimise the economic harms of Brexit, but we'll also be able to safeguard Scotland's place as a good global citizen. And in doing that, I think we'll bring benefits not just to Scotland, but to people right across the UK. So that is what I hope we can achieve in the year ahead to make sure that the future for our country remains a bright, open and welcoming one. Thank you very much indeed.
May I take the opportunity to thank very much the First Minister for that very interesting and stimulating address. It is truly an honour and a privilege for us here this evening to have you willing to come and address us and answer questions. I don't believe that there is really any bigger topic at the moment. This is the topic of our times. There's certainly no more controversial topic, and I don't believe there is a place in Scotland where you would find someone who isn't able to express some sort of opinion on the topic of Brexit. It impacts on every single one of us. From the list of attendees this evening and the people who are here, I see that we're full of, the room is full of very curious people, and I'm sure there will be lots of questions this evening. Given that time is short, and we want to make the most of this wonderful opportunity we have tonight, I would like to proceed quickly to open up the floor and invite questions from the audience. May I ask you, when you ask your question, that you state your name and your organisation, that you try your best to be short, You try your best to be focused, and you do not simply stand up and make a statement. I'm going to ask maybe 1 or 2 questions at a time so that more people can ask different things, and then we will invite the First Minister to respond. It will allow us hopefully to ask as many questions as possible. Now, I may look like a mild-mannered janitor, but I will cut you off if you make a statement.
I suspect that includes me as well.
You're exempt from that. We are very used to long-winded people in the Faculty of Advocates, and we have brought the Faculty of Advocates staff this evening, and there are fellow advocates hidden amongst you today who are not afraid to use it. So be aware and be warned. There are 2 roving mics, as I understand it. Please wait for the mic to arrive before you ask your question. I know it's really exciting to be standing up asking questions, but it makes it so much easier for everyone to hear what you're saying. So don't be shy. Don't miss the opportunity to ask the First Minister a question. We will run out of time. We have until 7:25, and I am under pain of death if I delay you from the glass of wine which is waiting. So the first question from the floor is going to come from Mr. James Blake. James, I hope you're here. Hello. Now, I don't want to add to the pressure, James, but everyone is looking at you. And are you used to it? I'm not going to ask why, but we're relying on you to demonstrate absolute perfection in following my instructions. So, name, organisation, short and focused, and you have the mic.
Right, James Blake, RSE Young Academy. First Minister, thank you. In the event of no deal, I assume that there will be renewed pressure for independence. You've talked about pressure for more devolution and more power. Leaving those 2 aside, what can the Scottish Government do? What can we do to mitigate some of the worst excesses of Brexit? And is there anything that Scotland can do to form its own partnerships, form its own deals with European partners and international partners? What scope is there?
Okay.
We'll proceed with James first, and then the next questions I'll ask in pairs.
Okay, Angela, I should say, if you ever decide to give up the law, which I don't expect will ever happen, teaching probably would be a very good profession, because you scared me with that warning. James, I will try to be brief in my answers as well, because I'm scared of the chair. But the first thing I should say is, before we think about what happens later this year, if there's a no-deal scenario, we should be determined to do everything we can to avoid that happening. And I guess what I'm saying is, if Theresa May was standing here, she would say that, she's got red lines and she's going to stick to those red lines and nothing's going to get in the way. Actually, the reality is very different. We've seen her red lines being swept away. We also know that there is potentially a majority in the House of Commons that would stand in the way of a hard Brexit. So I'm determined to do what I can, and I can't do it all on my own. The SNP, the Scottish Government can't, but to try to be part of a consensus that says we're not accepting a hard, reckless Brexit, and instead we think that option of single market membership is the right one. Now, that perhaps seems like a forlorn hope at the moment, but I don't think it is. I think opinion is moving in that direction. If Labour, I'm sorry to be party political, if Labour was to get its act together and come out for this now, there would be a majority in the House of Commons right now. Now, Jeremy Corbyn's position is inexplicable to me, but that's that. But there's pressure in his own party to move to this as well. So that's what we should do just now. And government political voices are important, but the more voices that are arguing for this, the more that pressure will build. In terms of the second part of your question, we published a paper just over a year ago that looked at, if the UK doesn't stay in the single market, are there options for differential arrangements for Scotland? Now, again, that was dismissed by the UK government as impossible. And yet, although I know it's not their preferred option, they have contemplated that for Northern Ireland, if that's what it takes to resolve some of the issues on the island of Ireland. So we know that those differential arrangements are not impossible. So we are exploring and investigating all of that, short of a sort of blanket differential arrangement. There are things that we're looking very carefully at. Arrangements, could Scotland stay within even if the rest of the UK doesn't? Erasmus, for example, Horizon 2020, some of the criminal justice elements too. So we are actively exploring all of these things. We mustn't just accept that there is an inevitability to a really hard, damaging, reckless Brexit.
Thank you. Let's take the next two questions. Two hands are up. If we can have the mic over there, please. So remember name, organisation, short and focused.
Thank you very much, First Minister. Jose Yarvine, President of Young European Movement UK. You mentioned that the EU is not perfect, and that is a statement with which many politicians agree, from Nigel Farage to Guy Verhofstadt. They all say that the EU is not perfect. So my question is, how would you move Europe forward, assuming that you get to decide? How would you change the policy, the institutions of the European Union?
And we'll take the person behind, please.
Nick Chadder, the Institute and Faculty of Actuaries. If we're restricted from encouraging or accepting migration from outside of the UK, can more be done to encourage migration from the rest of the UK to Scotland?
Thank you.
Okay, both good questions. I could probably, and I say this as a Europhile, I say this as somebody who wants to stay in the European Union, I could probably equally stand here all night and tell you all the things that irritate me at times about the European Union. I think, and this is a general statement, there's a lot of detail underneath this, but I think, the institutions of the European Union need to be less closed, more democratic, more open and transparent. I think there's a lot the European Union does that it shouldn't do in terms of interfering, if that's not too pejorative a word, in the domestic affairs of national states. For example, a very recent live example for the Scottish Government, we spent 5 years in court trying to defend and successfully defending a challenge to minimum pricing for alcohol, because the view put forward by those who took us to court was that that was contrary to European law. Now, I just don't think that European law should come into it when a government is taking a public health matter decision based on issues to do with distinctive issues of public health. So I think there are whole areas where the European Union should take a step back. I'm not in favour of ever greater political centralisation in the European Union. So I would not be in favour of that, and look critically at areas where I think the EU generally should take a step back and leave the space to national governments. And Nick, your point, yes, absolutely. I mean, these are not either ors. We need, our demographic challenge says we need to encourage people to come from all over the place, and we need, and much of the inward migration to Scotland already is from other parts of the UK, and we want that to continue. We want that to accelerate, and if you know anybody that's thinking of moving north, please encourage them to do so. Maybe don't tell them what the weather's like right now, but encourage them. So this is not an either or, but the idea that we will replace, if we suddenly find substantial restrictions, and we don't know yet what the post-Brexit immigration policy of the current UK government is going to be, but if we suddenly find ourselves with a significant restriction on our ability to attract people from outside of the UK, I think the idea that we can replace all of that just from other parts of the UK doesn't really add up, but that is not to say we shouldn't continue to encourage people from other parts of the UK.
Thank you. Two more questions, perhaps. Yes, one down at the front here and one up at the back.
Chris Carr, University of Edinburgh Business School. I think there are enough MPs that could find common cause to join you in opposing a really bad Brexit deal in a year's time. But there is a problem that virtually all MPs regard the last referendum as the voice of God. If that's the case, the only political solution to get those people on board would be to have a second validation referendum so that God can speak again. What do you think?
I was waiting there for that question. You've saved yourself at the end. Sorry, please, at the back.
First Minister, my name is Gareth Brown and I work for the political consultancy Message Matters here in Edinburgh. I'm from Northern Ireland, so I'm one of the few people who are fortunate enough to have be entitled to dual citizenship. I have a slightly tangential question, and your frustrations with the Joint Ministerial Committee that involves other devolved administrations has been well documented. And I wonder, just in light of the kind of renewed assertiveness from the new Taoiseach and Taoiseach, what is your view on, has this situation caused a new closeness between the Welsh Government and the Northern Ireland Executive and the Irish Government, and how do you see those relationships developing going forward?
Okay. I'll be as brief as I can on these questions, but they are big and important questions. Chris, your question, I'll come on to the specific point about a second EU referendum or an EU referendum on the terms of the deal in a moment. But just to underline your initial point, I do believe that if Jeremy Corbyn gets into a more sensible position in line with what most of his supporters want, there is the majority in the House of Commons there to be had for certainly staying within the single market. I don't understand his position. I mean, he still argues this ridiculous case that it's not possible to be in the single market if you're not in the European Union. Now, Norway would probably sort of point to itself as evidence that he's wrong on that, but no matter how often it is pointed out to him that he's wrong, he insists on saying that. He said it as recently as Sunday. Now, that's either he still doesn't know he's wrong, but presumably he's not stupid, so there then seems to be a sort of willful attempt to mislead people. So hopefully the pressure that he will get from his own ranks will change his position, and then that majority in the House of Commons could well be there. Now, I don't actually accept that it is not then possible within the terms of the 2016 referendum to have an outcome like that, because as I said in my remarks, I just don't accept that it is an absolutely necessary requirement of that referendum that we leave the single market. It's a requirement of that referendum that the UK leaves the European Union. I don't believe that mandate extends. So I think if you can get a majority in the House of Commons behind single market membership, I believe there is a very, very strong argument that that is consistent with the referendum result. On the issue of having another referendum, it's not the position of my party. It's not a position we are arguing for. I've said before that I think it could well become the case, particularly if there is a no-deal scenario, that becomes quite a difficult argument for the UK government to resist, because you have the situation where people didn't know what they were voting for in 2016, which actually, whatever way you voted in the independence referendum, there was a lot of detail on what you were voting for. You might not have agreed with that detail, but it was there. By contrast, in 2016, there was a slogan on the side of a bus and not much more than that. So that argument, if it's a no-deal scenario, may become compelling, it may become difficult to resist. I don't believe the majority, in the way that I believe the majority is there for single market membership, I'm not at this stage convinced that would be there for another referendum at this stage. But these things will take lots of twists and turns, and my priority is what is the best or at least worst outcome, and the rest of it is tactics and how best to deliver that, and that will be how I choose to approach that. Gareth, firstly, there is, and Brexit, if there is a silver lining, I guess, on this cloud, it has really strengthened the relationships between Scotland, the Scottish Government, and certainly the Welsh Government, and similarly between Scotland and Ireland. There is absolutely no doubt about that. I think it has forced all of us to look at what we've got in common and how we can build alliances and work together, and that's true generally. It's also been true within the particular arrangements of the intergovernmental mechanisms that we have in place. There are two that really are worth briefly mentioning. The British-Irish Council is the one that the Republic of Ireland obviously came out of the Good Friday Agreement, and the Republic of Ireland participate in that along with the devolved administration and the Crown dependencies. the Taoiseach, and not just the current Taoiseach, but all of the previous Taoiseachs, have always attended and do always attend the British Irish Council. Sir John Elvidge may remember, certainly not in my time as First Minister, and for a good few years before that, no Prime Minister has attended the British Irish Council. And that speaks volumes about the lack of priority that the UK government gives to some of these arrangements. The other mechanism is the Joint Ministerial Council, which includes the UK government and the devolved administrations. And there's not been a full Joint Ministerial Council for a year now. We were hoping to have one later this month. That doesn't look as if that's going to happen. There is a lack of commitment on the part of the UK, even to going through the motions sometimes of these things. And then when you do go through the motions and have the meetings, there's often a lack of commitment to making that meaningful. And again, if the UK is to operate as we're constantly told it is meant to, as a family of nations, equal nations operating in the UK, these arrangements have got to become much more meaningful than they are. But to go back to your question, there is absolutely no doubt that some of the leverage that we now have in trying to strengthen these arrangements comes from the much more close relationship between Scotland and Wales and Scotland and Ireland as well. And that will be, I think, increasingly important in the period that lies ahead.
Thank you. 2 more questions, please. Yes. 2 hands raised towards one at the rear and then one about 5 rows in front.
I'm Gavin McCrone. The health service...
Could you state your organisation, please?
I haven't got one, I'm retired.
All right, that's fine.
Long since
I'll let you off.
The recent events have shown very clearly that we have acute shortages of trained personnel in various professions, and particularly at the present time we see that in the health service. Should we not be doing a hell of a lot more to try and train more of our own people? Because Brexit will only make this much worse. I understand at present it's very difficult for school leavers to get into university to do medicine, for example, without an incredibly strong set of results.
You mentioned, Catherine Thorne, Institute and Faculty of Actuaries. You mentioned the per capita impact of various Brexit scenarios, and I was wondering if there's a concern that any of those scenarios will increase inequalities in our society and what we can do to mitigate that.
Okay, Gavin, yes is the short answer to your question. We are doing a great deal to increase the numbers who are going into training across the different health professionals. So year on year just now we're increasing the numbers going into nurse training, going into medical training. For example, we've just created a new graduate medical programme encouraging people to go in to do shorter medical courses if they have first degrees in other things, and targeting, in that sense, targeting particularly people who could be persuaded to go into general practice, because within medicine that is an area of particular stress at the moment in terms of our need for more GPs. So there's a huge amount of work going on across all of these different specialties to get more people in and training. And we have, at the last count, I think just over 12,000 more people working in the health service than was the case a decade ago. But we have this, the pressure on the health service just now, and again, this is not unique to Scotland, is coming, well, right now it's coming from lots of people with the flu, and no doubt today and tomorrow lots of people slipping on the ice, but more generally it's coming from the changing demographics. When as I have been doing on a daily basis just now, pouring into the detail of accident and emergency attendances, lots more people going to accident emergency because of flu, for example, but also more people when they go there requiring admission to hospital because they're older and sicker as a result of that. So we have that demographic pressure that we need to invest more in the health service, but also continue to reform how the health service is dealing with the demand that it faces. But we're facing that, as you rightly say, at the same time as we're facing the other impact of the demographic challenge, which is fewer people in our working age population. So yes, of course we have to train our own people, that's not just relevant in the health service, across the spectrum, but we cannot shy away from the importance in meeting that demographic challenge of continuing to have the ability to encourage people to come from elsewhere. And Catherine, your question, we don't, the modelling doesn't specifically look at the impact on inequality, but instinctively, I would say the answer to that question is undoubtedly yes. I think when, unless corrective action is taken, but when you face a situation where you're losing GDP growth because of a particular thing, as I say, without strong corrective action, that would, I think, almost inevitably increase the inequalities in our society. And that is, I think, another issue we should be concerned about. But the modelling didn't particularly look at that particular aspect. That's perhaps something I'll take away and look at to see whether we could apply some modelling to that question. Thank you.
Next questions. Oh, at the front, please.
Hi, my name is Josephine from the University of Edinburgh and Buchanan Institute. Thank you for your talk tonight. But there was one topic I think you failed a bit to elaborate on in terms of the implications of Brexit, and that's the environment and climate policies in Scotland. And in 2009, Scotland passed a very ambitious Climate Act, setting out very bold strategies for Scotland in terms of its emission targets. And in light of you openly admitting you are a Europhile, and I will say I am one too, coming from the EU, how do you plan on making Scotland meet those emission targets, considering these large subsidies, financial opportunities, and innovations that will be lost by being pulled out of the EU? What is Scotland going to do in ahead? What's your strategy? Thank you.
And just the row behind, please.
Hi, Steve Brusati, University of Edinburgh and the Young Academy. So first of all, I'd just like to thank you for all your support for those of us that have immigrated here, both in terms of policy and rhetoric. My question is a little bit on that front, that I think staying in the single market is great, but of course it's not really up to the UK to dictate what's going to happen in that negotiation, and the EU is on the other side, and it seems to be that they're holding to the line that to stay in the single market, that requires freedom of movement. And seeing how that was one of the most explosive political issues behind the vote, what do you see as a possible political solution to that conundrum? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Both, again, very good questions. Josephine, one of my concerns about Brexit is that the UK, although UK ministers would say that this is not going to happen, but over time, if we don't have the framework of EU regulation, whether it's on the environment or consumer rights or workers' rights, or even what they were claiming credit for at the weekend with the credit cards charges, then over time we will see a diminution in the UK of these protections, and I think that would be a huge mistake. The environment is clearly one area of concern. It's one of the areas of concern that we have when it comes to the withdrawal bill that I spoke about, because that would be one of these areas of currently devolved power where the withdrawal bill would restrict our freedom of manoeuvre if it passes in its current form. For the Scottish Government's part, we are determined not just to meet our current obligations on climate change, but to extend those obligations and meet those as well. We are currently broadly meeting our climate change emissions targets. When they were set back in 2009, they were some of the most ambitious in the world. We're meeting those. That's not easy to meet. We are shortly going to introduce new legislation which will introduce more stretching targets, and we're still deciding the final content of that. One of the issues that we're grappling with is whether we have the evidence and the clear pathway yet to get to a net zero emissions position and have that as our target. So we have absolutely no intentions in Scotland of rowing back from environmental protections. On the contrary, we want to go further. But it's one area, it's one of the examples of why it's so important not to lose our ability in the process of Brexit to act to the maximum within these areas of our own responsibility. And Steve, I should be clear here. I think the UK should drop its red line on freedom of movement, and if they're going to be in the single market, then that involves accepting the four freedoms. And while I said the demographic challenge for Scotland is more acute, and it is, I think the whole UK has to get real about the realities around migration and not not just give in to some of the mythology around migration. That said, I don't believe, I think it is a fact, that within the current treaty arrangements on free movement, the UK government could be doing more in terms of putting its own rules in place. Often we talk about free movement, and it's actually a bit of a misnomer, because it's not a complete free for all. There are restrictions on European free movement right now. So if you're here for longer than 3 months, you have to be in employment or be able to sustain yourself. It's not the case that there are no circumstances now in which the UK can't remove EU citizens if they break the law, or as one example. So it's not complete freedom of movement. And within those rules, I think the UK could, if it wanted to, make sensible changes that didn't involve ripping up the whole principle and therefore preventing itself taking part in the single market. So maybe I'm just one of life's great optimists, I don't know, but I still cling to the hope that common sense will start to prevail on some of this stuff before it's too late.
Thank you. More questions? Yes. We've had one hand. Anyone else want to ask a quick? Yes, and another gentleman there. So a mic just there, please, and then the gentleman in front.
Hello, I'm Theo Koutmeridis, an economist from the University of Glasgow and also an RSC Young Academy member. First of all, I would like to thank the First Minister for the great opportunity. And I would like to ask something related to the economic costs that you mentioned. I completely agree that there is no costless Brexit option, but the numbers we are mentioning, typically they are averages. So some households and some areas might get harmed disproportionately. And if at the top of this we add a potential economic cost of independence, then Scotland might be in a worse situation compared to the rest of the UK. So what would you do to make sure that this is not going to be the case?
Okay.
Yeah, I'm sorry, Gordon Downey from Shepherd and Wedderburn. Wanted to take you back to the future of the devolution settlement. And as you say, the Clause 11 is currently drafted is seen as problematic. There seems to be the prospect of compromise in amending Clause 11 to introduce a mechanism which I think currently goes by the expression common frameworks. Given the remarks you made earlier about difficulties of intergovernmental cooperation within the UK, what do you think is the necessary ingredients for making these as yet unspecified common frameworks effective?
Okay. First question, sorry, I didn't catch your name. I was glad to hear you were from Glasgow, though. I'm glad the west of the country is represented here this evening. On the issue of the coming together of independence and Brexit, and I won't go into the detail of the process of that at this stage unless anybody wants me to. For me, Scotland, we often talk about Scotland's deficit right now, and Scotland, like many other countries in the world, has a deficit. The UK has a deficit. Most countries in the Western world have a deficit. Independence, and why I am such a strong supporter of independence, it's about not accepting the inevitability of that. It's about giving yourself the power and the ability to implement and pursue policies that grow your economy faster, that encourage more people to come and live here, to grow your tax base, and to put your public finances on a better and a stronger footing. And part of the frustration I have is that not that the Scottish Government is without power altogether, but our levers around that are too limited. And the deficit position we're in just now is a feature of how we are governed at the moment. It's not a reflection of what the position would be if Scotland was to be independent. And part of being an independent country, and it's one of these things that I accept sometimes sounds a bit contradictory from the SNP. I want us to be an independent country, but participating fully in not just the single market, but the European Union. The European Union, after all, is it's a coming together of independent countries for their collective greater good. And the other point to stress very strongly, and I think the arguments that the UK government is making around Ireland, for example, actually bear this out. I am not advocating, I never have advocated, that we should choose trading with the rest of Europe at the expense of trading with the rest of the UK. I don't think Scotland should be forced to see that as an either or. And of course, the UK government right now is making very clear in its discussions about Ireland that the Republic of Ireland doesn't have to choose between trading with the UK or trading with the EU. The optimal position for Scotland is, in my view, an independent country, part of the British Isles, still with the British Irish Council cooperating, trading across the UK and the British Isles, but also having that ability to trade fully across a market that is 8 times the size of the UK. The single market is the world's biggest economy, and that is the best position for Scotland in terms of building a stronger, more diverse and more open economy in the future. And that, I think, is at the core of the argument that I make. Gordon, in terms of, you're absolutely right, part of the negotiation that is underway with the Scottish and Welsh and UK government just now is about some of these areas where, you know, again, as somebody who supports Scottish independence, I have always recognised that if you share an island, there will be some things that make sense to coordinate across the whole territory. You know, animal welfare, for example, it would make no sense to have different animal welfare rules unless, you know, the ones elsewhere were not sufficient in your view. So I recognise the need to have common approaches on some things. The issue at stake here is whether that is done by agreement or whether it's done by imposition. Now, as long as this clause 11 that I've talked about is in that bill, no matter what discussions and agreements we try to reach around common frameworks, the UK government will always have the whip hand, because if we don't agree, then they've got clause 11 to effectively impose that position. So even if we come to an agreement that says, well, on all of these things where we think we need common frameworks, we've kind of broadly agreed the outcome, we can't agree to have clause 11 in that bill, because in future, if there's ever a disagreement about the content of a common framework, we're powerless because of the legislative position. So agreeing common frameworks, we are absolutely open and keen to do that, but we cannot have a position where they can be forced upon Scotland by imposition. It should be by agreement, and you know, that's a position that the Welsh government feel just as strongly about as we do.
We have time for 2 final questions. I think the gentleman here and behind were the first. Sorry.
Thank you, First Minister. Over here.
Sorry, I can see you.
Thank you, First Minister. Bill Roger, European Movement in Scotland. It might have been a throwaway remark at the start of your talk, but you just said in the passing that you believed an independent Scotland in Europe would be a good thing for Europe. I just wondered if you could elaborate on the particular reasons you might have had in your mind for saying that.
Okay.
Thank you. George Brechin. No fixed organisation, but a displaced Glaswegian.
Sorry, I remember you from your health service days, George.
To a certain extent, speaking here, you're preaching to the converted. And that's going to be true most of the places you speak in Scotland. And Sadiq Khan, about Brexit. Sadiq Khan is also preaching to the converted in London. Do you have any tactics about taking the argument and the discussion to those parts of the country, the UK, which didn't vote to remain?
Okay. Well, Bill, it wasn't entirely a throwaway remark. I mean, I think an independent Scotland would be good for everybody in Scotland and further afield. But I suppose what I was briefly alluding to was, I think Scotland's got a lot to offer. And we do offer that. We make our voice heard across Europe and elsewhere. But, you know, as an independent country, you can do that on a broader range of issues and at the top table of organisations like the European Union. So I think, in a sort of reasonably humble way, I think Scotland as a small country has got a lot to offer in terms of our policy experience, in terms of some of the values that we champion. So I do think it would be good for Europe as well as for our own country. Yeah, George, yes, as much as I not infrequently go to other parts of the UK and talk about issues like this and try to make the argument from a different perspective to the one that is perhaps heard more often in some other parts of the UK. You know, I respect the views of people who voted to leave. I don't agree with them, but I absolutely respect them. I respect some of the motivations and some of the concerns that lay behind that vote. But what I think we all have a duty to do, and I think you're absolutely right, it's harder but often more important to do this to the unconverted than it is to the converted, is take on some of the misconceptions that I think drove a lot of the Brexit referendum. I've talked a lot about migration tonight. It strikes me, and I'm not trying to dismiss people's concerns about migration. You know, I would never do that. They are real and they deserve to be treated seriously and with respect. But it often strikes me how much of people's concerns, and it's not a criticism, it's just a fact, how much of it is based on things that are just not accurate. You know, you often hear people talk about the fact that migrants who come here are a net cost to our society and our economy. Now, one of the things the paper we published yesterday does is set out the reality. The EU migrants contribute hugely to our overall GDP. They contribute to our tax revenues. So I think there's a duty in all of us. You know, at the end of the day, if people still have a particular view, that's fine, but let's try and inform the debate with facts. The other thing that I think during the EU referendum, which frustrated me, and is unlike the migration argument, I take my share of the responsibility for this, because it was very difficult in that campaign, and I remember taking part in debates south of the border. Suddenly you're in a campaign where you're trying to put across the positives about the European Union, but you're doing that against the backdrop of years, decades, where politicians, all of us actually, just moan about the European Union and talk about all the things it does wrong, and in a very short space of time to try and reverse that and turn that around was very difficult, and in many parts of the UK proved impossible. So, you know, there is a big obligation to try to inform this debate. Time is running out to do it, but there's an obligation on all of us, and I include myself in that, to make the tough arguments and to be prepared to make them to the toughest audiences sometimes. And probably the argument I've made tonight on migration, I'm sure there are many audiences where I would get a very, very tough time for making that argument. But if you believe it's really important to the future of the country, then you've got a duty to make it.
Well, sadly, our time is running out, and I'd like to say thank you. You've all been very well behaved, so gold stars all round. And I would now like to invite Sir John Eldridge to come and do the vote of thanks. Thank you.
Thank you. It's my pleasure to thank the First Minister for being with us this evening. At the beginning of her remarks, she drew a comparison between the success of this series and Edinburgh's Winter Festival and the Hogmanay Show. I have difficulty seeing the First Minister as interchangeable with Rag and Bone Man, but but there is an important sense in which the First Minister is star of the show. This series, I think, would be unsustainable without the First Minister's willingness to participate in it. Without her important voice, it would, I think, be difficult to sustain the framework of listening to a range of voices from the party leaders. So I think it's right for us to be grateful, not just for what the First Minister has given us this evening, but for her support that makes the continuation of this programme possible. But as well as the simple fact of being here, I think we have strong reasons to be grateful for the substance of what the First Minister has said to us this evening, and in particular for the clarity of that substance. I very much doubt that there is anyone who will leave this room this evening in the slightest doubt, not just about the core positions that the First Minister has articulated, but about the reasoning, the evidence that underpins those positions. And in a period when we have at least one other major party whose supporters, according to opinion polling, appear to be absolutely equally balanced in their view of whether that party is a passionate advocate of the EU or a passionate opponent of the EU. It's not to be taken for granted to be given the clarity and force of argument that the First Minister has given us this evening. And in many ways, it's perhaps the greatest gift that a speaker can give an audience, that absolute clarity about position and case. So I invite you all to join me in thanking the First Minister for this evening.
Okay, well, thank you very much, colleague. Thank you very much, First Minister. Good evening, everybody. My name's Nasser Mir. I fully appreciate I'm standing between you and the wine reception, and that's a very precarious place to be, so I won't take very long at all. This is just an opportunity, really, to say a few words about the Young Academy, who are a co-sponsor of this series and have been of other series in previous years. And it's a reflection, I think, of the continuing generosity of the David Hume Institute that they come and let us speak to you at the end of these important talks. Perhaps like most who are not so young anymore, we continue to live here in our parents' house in the RSC. And those of you who've come to previous lectures and previous series will know something about our mission statement, our creation over 6 years ago, and about our aims and objectives and our key thematic areas in which we work. So I won't repeat those here, other than to say that we represent different sectors and different disciplines, and that we work collaboratively to inform public policy, but also to support Scottish society more broadly, not least in working in schools, through our research and our practical experience. We are made up of medics, civil servants, historians, social scientists, physical scientists of all possible kind, and members of the business community and industry here in Scotland. And so as such, there's always a multitude of activities underway, and I'd just like to mention one key one here. Perhaps unsurprisingly, in the last year or so, a significant amount of our energy has been geared to activities we see as protecting and enhancing Scotland's social values and indeed its international influence in light of Brexit. Our report into the ongoing impact of Brexit features 10 scenarios spanning politics and the economy, migration and national identity, and research funding, as well as looking at the creative industries broadly conceived. Our take-home message, that there's a serious risk that paths to UK citizenship will become much more restrictive, and that our national identity is much more insular. For some, of course, this has been a stated ambition, if not objective. In our view, in our report, the challenge for Scotland is to look outwards and to try to buck that probable trend. As a small country that benefits profoundly from diversity across a variety of labour market sectors and industries, as well as in education, in science, in the creative arts, in technology, it's imperative that Scotland continues to forge unity through diversity rather than against diversity. And in some areas, including in the political narratives about Scottish national identity and what it means to be Scottish, that can be done right here. In other areas, such as in citizenship rights, I guess a principled pragmatism is going to be necessary. In other words, the Scottish Government and partner agencies and civil society are going to have to make the most of spaces for innovation within current settlements. And I guess the challenge in our view is very much to cultivate a Big Ten Scottishness that's open to the kinds of revision and addition that comes with the distinct characteristics of new groups settle here in Scotland, and perhaps even at a more elementary level. We very much feel that we don't really know a great deal of how professionals in different sectors are planning to act with the uncertainty in light of Brexit, not just for them in terms of their career, but for them in terms of their families. And so to this end, YAS has created a Brexit observatory and gathered testimonies and brought together a series of case studies from individuals and organisations in Scotland currently affected by Brexit. The observatory is online. It's a resource that provides much needed data on exactly how Brexit is having an impact on Scottish society today. So more to come on that. But in the meantime, do please follow us on Twitter, Facebook, consult our web pages. We are currently recruiting our next cohort of YAS members, so do please inform people of that. We're always keen to work with new partners. And so to the drinks reception, which I can hear outside, where there will also be a number of other YAS members whom I'm sure will be keen to speak to you further about our work. Thank you very much.